The Lackaparle County Historical Society presents Coming to America.
Today we are going to learn about our ancestors who came over to America in the 1800s and early 1900s. I want you to think about this question. Why did they come? Let's find out. The title of this picture is America, a nation of one people from many countries. Immigrants came to America from many countries around the world for many varied reasons. It has been said that the boldest and most adventurous people set off first. The immigrants who came to Minnesota in the 1800s were mainly from Germany, Norway, and Sweden. People from Ireland, Finland, Poland, and England also settled in Minnesota. Why did they come here? Families from Ireland came to America to escape the terrible famines there. People there were facing death by starvation due to the potatoes turning black and rotting in the ground. The immigrants from England came to escape being treated poorly because of their religion and political beliefs. Others came because they were very poor and hoping for a better life. Germans were the largest immigrant group in the 1850s to get away from the wars that were taking place there. During this time, their crops were poor. This made the price of food and other items go up. This is a sample of a letter written by a German immigrant to his family still in Germany. If a man there has a handful of land more than you have to bow and scrape and take off your hat to him. That is certainly not true here. In this country, a man who is healthy, even if he has nothing, can get along better than a man in our village in Germany who has property worth $1,000. One German immigrant wrote letters to his aunt and uncle in Germany about how wonderful Minnesota was. It had a very healthy climate, beautiful and natural scenery, and clean, fresh air. Many people spread the word about Minnesota. They often exaggerated the territory's good points. Sometimes they outright lied. Some people even claimed that disease was almost unheard of due to the chilly climate. Here is a chart showing the immigration numbers from the years from 1840 to 1860 of the English, Irish, and German peoples. The Irish started out strong, with the Germans increasing in the later years. Note the peak years of 1869 and 1880 on this chart. The largest group of immigrants who came to Minnesota were from Norway. Many immigrants, 90% of them, began immigrating to America after 1865. In 1864, the lower classes, such as farmers and laborers, had many problems. Families were having a tough time making a living on a small section of land that had been in their families for many years and handed down to them. There was not enough good land to grow crops on. Only 1/3 of the land in Norway was suitable. Notice how small the farms are in this picture. The crops were failing due to the weather and some other problems. When their crops were poor, they did not have enough to eat either. Some people took layers of bark from certain trees, ground it up, and then added it to their flour. Others ate moss and grass in order to survive. Young people could not find good jobs. A farmhand might make only $10 to $20 for an entire year. The work was manually difficult, and there was little time for relaxation, recreation, or education. It is estimated that 78% of all the Norwegian immigrants were from the rural areas in Norway. In other words, farm families. They left Norway in search of a better life. Many officials and clergymen in Norway warned them of what could lay ahead for them. They told of disadvantages that were inaccurate. This information did not stop everyone interested in immigration. Many felt that they had nothing to lose by leaving Norway. They were desperate to improve their living conditions. America was promising land, rich and flat, for free, thanks to the Homestead Act of 1862. Mr. and Mrs. Peter Simpson of Parle County crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a small sailboat because they heard about homesteading, and Peter thought it sounded like an adventure. Those who had already immigrated reported in their letters how good things were in America. They told their friends and relatives about the inexpensive land with a large amount of firewood. The immigrants would have to be willing to possibly never see some of their family members or friends again. Many of the future immigrants were eager to join their friends or relatives who already lived in America. The bottom of this poster tells facts about Minnesota, which I will read to you. Minnesota has never had a crop failure, has never had any frozen grain, has the greatest yield per acre, has the greatest aggregate yield of wheat. Advertisements were posted in European countries to encourage others to come. Over 800,000 Norwegians came, about 1/3 of the country's population. This ad claims that Minnesota has land and water of the best kind. There's no ague, a sickness with chills, or fever. Claims can be made by the rich and poor. People came because of exaggerated stories of abundant job opportunities and freedom to do what they wanted. Often a member of a family came first and saved every penny to buy a steamer ticket for members of the family still living in the old country. Many of them were excited for the adventure. Large families were among the early immigrants. Many immigrants were in the age group of 35 to 40 with 3 or more children. This is a picture of Ole Hagebuck. He and his wife Ingeborg were early settlers in Parle County who came from Norway in 1867. They were one of those families that were running out of land for farming to support their growing families and felt the need to immigrate to the United States. This is a picture of Berit Hagebuck. Older couples wanted to come to America because their grown children were coming. They did not want to live their lives never seeing their children or grandchildren again. They also wondered who would take care of them in their old age if they did not live near their children. This woman is Berit Hagebuck, Ole's mother. Berit and her husband John felt they were too old to be starting over. They were in their 50s, but they wanted to be near their family members, so they came to America also. They lived near Madison and Dawson. Berit left her nice log house in Norway for this sod house, a tremendous change for her. Berit could not imagine living in a house made of dirt, but she lived in her soddy until her death in 1903. Berit is the great-great-grandmother of Carol Olson of Madison. Immigrating to America was a monumental event in the lives of our European ancestors. They were saying goodbye to everything familiar and heading toward the unknown in search of a better life. Preparing to immigrate was no easy task. They had to choose those items they would take with them, belongings they could afford to ship, and those items they could sell to help pay for their trip. The main obstacle was to overcome the cost of travel. Many families did without any extras and saved for years in order to put aside enough money to pay the fare. It often cost the equivalent of over 1/3 of a laborer's annual income to bring an average-sized family to America. A hired man on a Norwegian farm earned about $10 a year, and it may cost $30 to $35 for passage on a ship. This meant a hired man would have to save all his money for several years and then could be penniless when he arrived in America. If they owned goods and or property like cattle, primitive farm machinery, farmland, and household goods, things they could sell off, it gave them the means to buy their fares quicker. Once immigrants arrived at the port of departure, a few obstacles remain. They had to pass various physical exams to prove they were at a certain level of health in order to be allowed to travel. This was to prevent the spread of disease while on the ship, as well as to prevent diseases from being carried to their destination country. Physical exams and eye exams sometimes held immigrants up for days or even an entire week. Well, what was the cost of traveling by steamship or sailing ship? In 1854, an immigrant paid $25 for a voyage from Norway. In May of 1870, Peter Trelsted, seen here, who settled in Madison, Minnesota, paid 148 kroner, or about $53 in today's money. So you can see that the prices went up in later years. For those leaving from the city of Kragerø, seen here, one of Norway's largest port cities, the cost of their trip was determined by what route they wanted to take, going to New York or Quebec, Canada. Taking the Quebec route was significantly cheaper than going to New York. Here is a picture of the city of Kragerø. Wouldn't this have been a hard place to leave? Such a beautiful location. What supplies could they bring? Immigrants had to plan carefully to decide what to bring with them. In the early years of immigration, they brought a number of objects they thought they might need after they arrived in America. The women might want to bring their spinning wheel and their iron griddle. The men would like to bring a good harness or an axe. One Norwegian man brought all the equipment from his blacksmith shop, including the bellows. One man brought many of his farm tools, including 2 heavy millstones. As the number of immigrants increased, the space became limited on the ships. They often only had room for bare necessities. Such necessities often consisted of clothes and tools. If the family's livelihood came from a skilled trade such as carpentry or items for farming, such as a tool seen here, this is a picture of a swap hook, which was a harvest tool. They would want to bring their valuable family heirlooms and basic provisions for the trip. Immigrants also were advised to bring along equipment such as a water bucket, cooking pot, coffee kettle, dishes, and eating utensils to be used on the ship. They also had to bring their own bedding and food. If you paid more for your ticket, you could bring more with you. For the extra cost, they could bring such items as weapons for defense, tools, seed grains, shoes, vegetable and or fruit plantings, a few spices, a bolt of cloth, nails, medicinal potions, needles and thread, thimbles, awls, buckles, powder, ball and shot, and their Bible. If they were lucky, they could bring extra clothes. Most of the passengers had trunks in which to hold their possessions. Heavy trunks were a necessity to protect their valued items. The Norwegians distinguished their trunks from other groups coming to America by decorating them with colorful painted designs called rosemalling. Many decorated their trunks with the owner's name, initials, and the year they departed for America. The trunks also served as tables on the ship, but sometimes were difficult to keep from sliding around during rough seas. There are accounts about passengers who were injured by their trunks as they slid back and forth. This is a trunk we have at the museum. It is dated 1883 and was owned by Mrs. Ole J. Haugen. She was the grandmother of Ethel Shellstead of Madison. This large trunk was owned by Ethel Mellom from Dawson. Note the date on this one, 1778. We invite you to tour the museum and take a closer look at them. Would all of your essential items fit inside one of these trunks? The excitement of departure was followed by sadness and tears as they realized that they were leaving their families and their known world behind them. It took time to sell all of their possessions they could not take or would not need in America. This picture shows a ship with many of the immigrants prepared to leave on their long journey. This is a ship called a masted bark ship. It has 3 or more masts. The trips across the ocean were not fun, not like the cruise ships of today. Most Europeans traveled by steamship and had to stay in the steerage section. This is a diagram showing the parts of the ship. Notice the family section, between deck area, storage, and ballast section. Many of the passengers stayed in the steerage section of the ship. This area is also known as the between deck. This is located in the lower decks where the ship's engines and steering controls were also located. The passengers in this area were those who traveled at the cheapest rate. They had little privacy. There were no separate rooms for men and women. They stayed in small, cramped living quarters, which aided in the spread of illnesses. One compartment might have 400 passengers. The bunks were often so close together and narrow that you could hardly turn over without bumping against the upper berth. Family bunks were available on some ships. Women often had to share a bunk with their children. The average space of a steamship berth where they slept and stored their belongings was approximately 6 feet by 2 feet. Notice in this photo how crowded they are. This was a third-class area on a Scandinavian ship. The bunks had mattresses stuffed with hay or seaweed. The passengers had to provide their own pillows and blankets. Thus, lice and fleas were able to thrive there. Lois Peterson Moe of Lacoparo County was 19 years old when she came to America on a sailboat, a trip that took 17 weeks. She reported that the beds on the boats needed to be improved. Lois and her family covered themselves in newspapers to stay warm. On many ships, the passengers, 2 per day, were assigned to clean the decks. They often collected rainwater for all types of washing. There would usually be many people out on the deck during the daytime to get fresh air and a place to exercise. It would have been hard to find a suitable time to clean the decks with so many people on board. What were the risks of traveling? During storms, the doors had to be latched. The passengers had little sunlight or fresh air. They had difficulty standing or even had trouble staying in their beds as they would slide around. Many of the passengers who were not already sick got seasick during the turbulent weather, and those who had been sick got worse. Seasickness was constant for many travelers. One immigrant reported, "A good many are sick and vomiting. Some people threw up after eating their very first meal on the ship." Although some people adjusted to the constant rocking and bouncing of the ship, others spent their entire trip nearly bedridden with nausea. Some were so seasick they starved to death during the voyage. The crew members tried to get the passengers above deck as much as possible to prevent this. Those who were not seasick often got sick from smelling the stench of those who did. The passengers shown here are out on the deck to get some fresh air to try to feel better. The chamber pots were hard to empty during storms. Unemptied chamber pots were not pleasant to have on the ships. The ship Norden, which sailed from Norway, had 400 passengers on it in 1866. There were only 2 primitive toilets on the entire ship. The smell got so bad sometimes that the crew members did not want to go down to where they were located. The passengers on the Larvig in 1854 endured many storms that often lasted several weeks off and on. This trip took 11 weeks and 3 days. Due to the many storms, they had to have the hatches closed for several weeks. One man had to throw up over the railing of the ship due to seasickness. He had his teeth on the railing and lost many of them. Many of the passengers got violent diarrhea and they began to die one after the other. The crew began getting ill also. They almost ran out of food and faced starvation. They hoped for mild weather so that they could fish. In the end, 19 passengers died, in part due to the severe weather. Due to poor ship construction, shipwrecks were often the cause of deaths among the passengers, especially in the early 1800s. In 1834, 17 ships were lost at sea. By the middle and end of the 19th century, though, ships became larger and safer, partly due to government regulations. Surprisingly, disease killed many more passengers than shipwrecks did due to the crowded and unsanitary conditions on the ships. The majority of those who died on the sailing ships were the infants and children who often caught pneumonia. Some people were sick the entire trip, probably due to the lack of water. Many contracted contagious diseases such as typhus, cholera, and dysentery. Many immigrants went straight from the ship to the hospital, where often their survival rates were low. The passengers that had been sick the entire trip could be sent back to the country from which they came. There usually were not any doctors on board to give medicine or advice to those who were sick or dying. 90% of the ships had no doctors. There was no medicine, but some were given gruel. Gruel is a type of food consisting of oats, wheat, rye flour, or rice, which is boiled in water or milk. It is a thinner version of porridge that may be drunk more than eaten. It does not need to be cooked, which made it more convenient for those traveling on ships. Gruel was thought to be a reliable home remedy. People believed it provided a cure for diseases of the stomach, as it was one of the easiest foods to digest. Charles Erickson from Lac qui Parle County stated that his little sister, aged 2 or 3, died while on the ship and was buried at sea. On one ship, 49 out of 280 passengers died from typhoid fever. Sharks followed the ship and attacked the bodies of the dead as they were thrown overboard. The Wisemantel family from Germany had a little girl who died only a few days after being on the ship. They made it look like she was alive by keeping her bundled up and pretending to feed her in order to give her a proper burial when they reached New York. They did not want to feed her to the sharks. The ship's carpenter often made the coffins. A passenger later told how sad it was to see the little coffins out on the seas as they sailed away. If there were a lot of deaths on a voyage, they sometimes ran out of lumber to make the coffins. In this situation, the dead would be wrapped in canvas. One immigrant wrote that once their ship lost its anchor, everyone had to get into the lifeboats and they were taken to a cattle steamer. This steamer transported cattle to other countries. They were allowed very few belongings off the ship to take with them. One immigrant had her little handbag with her thimble, scissors, a few handkerchiefs, and a little money. That is all she could bring with her to America. How many people were on a ship? Well, the number of passengers varied according to the size of the ship. The greater the number of passengers, the greater the profit for the ship owners. Many ship owners looked the other way when it came to the number of passengers. When the Harsteads came to America, their ship was about 100 people over capacity. The crowded ships resulted in worsened hygienic conditions, exposing the passengers to more illnesses. As a result, a law was passed in 1863 restricting the number of passengers on board ships. The immigrants were to be insured a minimum of space, and cargo was not to be stored on the same deck as the passengers. How long did the trips take? In 1840, the voyage from Norway to New York required from 8 to 12 weeks, depending on wind and weather. Until the 1850s, many people traveled on sailing ships, with the average voyage lasting about 43 days. Steamships eventually replaced sailing ships for many immigrants by the 1870s. Steamships shortened the voyage to 12 to 14 days. However, 20 years after the steamships were used, many immigrants still chose to travel on the sailing ships because they were less expensive. J.F. Jacobson, an early businessman in Lackaprow County and one of our early legislators, came from Norway at the age of 8, and the journey took 3 months. This was considered to be a very long trip. These journeys could take much longer than anticipated if they did not have mild weather. When this happened, some of the passengers almost faced starvation if their food supplies ran out. Ole Retrum, an early pioneer of Lackaprow County, arrived from Norway in 1863. The voyage took 7 weeks and 3 days, almost 2 months. What did they eat while on board the ship? The passengers had to bring their own food. They brought food that could be stored for the entire voyage. They brought meat that was smoked or salted, like dried pork and herring. They brought food items such as peas, potatoes, flatbread, flour for porridge, butter, whey cheese, sugar, rice, molasses, tea, and possibly sour milk. These foods were often stored in a hold beneath the between decks, and each day the passengers had to go down to fetch provisions. On some ships, the captain had to ensure that each passenger received 3 quarts of water daily. Often the quality of water was lacking. They had to prepare their food on the ship's galley placed up on deck. On some ships, there were no more than a couple of galleys to be shared by all the passengers. The lines for preparing food could easily become long, especially when there were several hundred passengers. Some ships supplied some food in case of the immigrants' food ran out. They brought enough provisions for 10 weeks. Some of the immigrants brought flatbread, seen here, which was made in great quantities, and it would keep a long time. A favorite meal was made by crumbling flatbread into a bowl of milk, like our modern-day cereal. Ole Retrum stated that his mother made 300 pieces of flatbread, which were 24 inches in diameter. They placed the flatbread in extra tubs for their voyage. Some immigrants arrived at Castle Garden, an inspection station located across from the Statue of Liberty. Castle Garden served as a station to examine and process new immigrants until 1890. Hundreds of immigrants passed through here each day, thousands each month. In 1892, Ellis Island became the inspection station after Castle Garden closed. Ellis Island was the gateway for over 12 million immigrants, as it was the busiest station for over 60 years, 1892 to 1954. At Ellis Island, the immigrants could purchase train tickets, exchange money, seek out directions, learn about employment opportunities, and use other services. Remember, most of them did not speak English, so that was another challenge for them in coming to America. Immigrants could sleep on the floor for a couple nights until they got their bearings. These services also helped to shield the immigrants from the thieves and opportunists who hung around the harbor waiting to prey upon the ill-informed people who arrived there. The immigrants were given medical exams to prevent those with contagious diseases from entering the country. Those with visible health problems or diseases were sent home or held at the hospital for extended periods of time. More than 3,000 immigrants died at the hospital on Ellis Island. At its peak, there were 5,000 immigrants who arrived there daily. When they arrived, they were asked 29 questions, such as their name, occupation, were they a criminal, who paid their fare, where they were going, and how much money they had. The American government thought it was important that the new arrivals had between $18 to $25 so that they could support themselves and have enough money to get started. In 2015, that was about a value of $600. On my grandpa's questionnaire from 1903, they wanted to know if he had $50, and if not, how much did he have? About 2% of the immigrants were denied admission and were sent back to their country of origin for reasons such as having a chronic contagious disease, insanity, or a criminal background. Those who thought their journey ended when they reached America were badly mistaken. Several weeks or more of difficult travel was ahead for them. To give you an idea of what it took to get to their final destination in the United States, here are some transportation samples. If they were traveling from New York City, they may have moved by steamship up the Hudson River to Albany, New York. This ship moved faster as it was powered by steam engines that turned to paddle wheels or propellers. They may have traveled by canal boat on the Erie Canal to Buffalo, and again by steamship through the Great Lakes to Michigan, Wisconsin, or Minnesota. Notice how the horses have to pull this boat. Some were sent by way of the St. Lawrence River. They may have traveled by cart or wagon pulled by a team of oxen to get to Parle County and beyond. Some of them even had to walk. Many were able to travel out west by train. This was a huge advantage over horses, oxen, or other forms of transportation. As you can see, many kinds of transportation were needed to get to their final destinations. As you learned from the information presented to you, coming to America was no easy task. The men, women, and children who left their home countries had to be very determined, hard-working, and brave people. Once they were cleared to live in America, they also had many years of work ahead of them to make a living and support their families. Those who made it to see the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island felt their new life would now begin with the things they longed for and what drew them to America: freedom, economic opportunity, and plentiful land on which to make a living.